In this compelling story, Judge Derrick Walker, a respected figure in his community, finds himself the target of racial profiling during a routine traffic stop. What begins as a deeply humiliating encounter with Officer Casey Grant quickly spirals into a larger conspiracy, revealing a network of corruption within the local police department and city officials. As Derrick joins forces with Detective Raymond Lee and even Officer Grant, who begins to see her own biases, they uncover how a powerful construction company, Omega Builders, manipulates justice to serve its interests. Determined to bring the truth to light, Derrick risks everything, his reputation, his career, and even his safety, to expose the corruption in a live television broadcast. Through his actions, Derrick sparks a citywide movement, leading to the arrest of numerous officials and the dismantling of Omega Builders' corrupt influence. Realizing that true change requires more than removing a few guilty parties, Derrick resigns from the bench and establishes an independent organization to hold local institutions accountable. His story is a testament to the power of courage, community, and the enduring fight for justice. Before we dive into this gripping tale of resilience, truth, and the battle against deep-seated corruption, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this inspiring story, don't forget to subscribe. Judge Derrick Walker sat comfortably in his new Mercedes, tapping his fingers lightly on the steering wheel, humming along to the smooth jazz playing softly from the car speakers. The leather seats still carried that new car smell he loved, and driving through the shaded lanes of Maple Avenue felt like a well-deserved reward after years of hard work. It was the kind of neighborhood he'd always dreamed of living in, with stately mansions, lush lawns, and white picket fences. Reaching this place had taken years of dedication and determination. Suddenly, Derrick's peaceful drive was interrupted by the sight of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. His brow furrowed in confusion. He'd been driving well within the speed limit, carefully obeying every traffic rule. Still, he knew he had no choice but to pull over. With a sigh, Derrick slowed down and pulled the car over to the side of the road. He tried to keep himself calm, thinking this might just be a routine check. But as he saw the officer walking towards him, a nagging worry stirred in his mind. The officer was a woman with a serious expression and sharp eyes. She approached with her hand resting on her holster, an action that seemed instinctive but made the atmosphere feel more tense. "License and registration," she ordered, her tone firm and clipped. Without protest, Derrick took out his wallet and handed over his documents. He maintained his composure, but couldn't resist asking, "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" The officer, whose badge read Casey Grant, ignored his question, inspecting his documents with a wary, almost suspicious look. After a moment, she glanced up, her gaze hard. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." Derrick was taken aback by this demand. He'd done nothing wrong and felt the situation was being blown out of proportion. Keeping his voice calm, he said, "I don't understand. What's the issue, officer?" "I said, step out of the vehicle," Officer Grant repeated, her hand tightening on her holster. "Now." Derrick felt a growing sense of discomfort as he noticed a few neighbors peeking through their curtains, curious about the unfolding scene. He could feel a mixture of anger and humiliation rising within him, but he knew that staying calm was the only way to handle this situation. Slowly, he opened his car door and stepped out, wondering how a simple drive had turned into this public spectacle. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," Grant commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Derrick took a deep breath, steadying himself before complying. He turned and placed his hands on the roof of the car as she ordered, feeling a wave of embarrassment as he stood in front of his own home. Forced into a posture of submission, in a neighborhood where he'd worked so hard to belong. Grant started to pat him down, her hands moving firmly, as if she were dealing with a known criminal. "We've had reports of car thefts in this area," she said, her tone filled with suspicion. "This vehicle matches the description of one that was stolen last week." Derrick clenched his jaw, trying to keep his anger in check. He wanted to tell her that he'd only bought this car 3 days ago, that it was entirely legitimate, but something told him she wouldn't be interested in hearing his explanation. "I assure you, this car is not stolen," he said, carefully controlling his tone. I purchased it just 3 days ago. If you'd allow me to explain. Save it for the station. Grant interrupted, her hand reaching for a pair of handcuffs. Derrick's mind raced. He knew his rights better than anyone, but right now it didn't seem to matter. The weight of systemic injustice pressed on him, a reminder of how the system could so easily overlook years of accomplishment and integrity. But Derrick Walker was not a man to back down easily. Taking a deep breath, he spoke with a calm, unwavering tone. "Officer Grant," he said, his voice steady, "before you do something you might regret, I'd suggest calling your superior. I believe they'd be very interested to know that you're about to arrest a federal judge without probable cause." Grant's expression faltered, her hand hovering over her handcuffs. "You expect me to believe that you're a judge?" "I expect you to do your job properly," Derrick replied firmly. "That includes verifying my identity before making a wrongful arrest. Call your superior, now." There must have been something in his tone that got through to her, as Grant hesitated, then slowly stepped back. She looked uncertain, but took out her radio, her eyes never leaving Derrick as she relayed the situation. As they waited, Derrick could feel the tension mounting. He knew his neighbors were watching, possibly even judging him, and he felt a sting of anger and frustration. This incident was a painful reminder of the stereotypes he'd fought so hard to overcome, the biases that persisted despite all he'd achieved. Finally, Grant's radio crackled to life, and a gruff voice came through. "Grant, what's the situation over there?" Grant quickly explained, but her voice had lost some of its initial confidence. When she finished, there was a pause and then a response. "Grant, stand down immediately. Judge Walker is a respected member of the community. I'll be there shortly." The color drained from Grant's face as she lowered her radio, looking at Derrick with an expression mixed with confusion and shame. I apologize, Your Honor. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Derrick straightened his jacket, holding on to his dignity despite the ordeal. "A misunderstanding?" he replied quietly, though his voice carried a sharp edge. "Is that what we're calling racial profiling these days, Officer Grant?" Nah. Before she could respond, another police car pulled up and Captain Jeffrey Harris, the local precinct's head, stepped out with a serious expression on his face as he approached. Derrick could see from the captain's demeanor that this situation, though minor in appearance, could be the start of something far bigger than either he or the officer had imagined. Captain Jeffrey Harris walked toward them, his face a mask of both anger and apology. As he reached Derrick, he nodded respectfully, though his gaze soon shifted to Officer Grant with a hard, reproachful look. "Judge Walker," he said, his voice strained, "I cannot apologize enough for what has happened here. We'll get to the bottom of this situation, I promise." Derrick met the captain's gaze, 1,000 unspoken words passing between them. He appreciated the apology, but he knew that what had just happened was part of a deeper, more troubling issue. It wasn't about him alone. It was about the ingrained prejudices that affected every person of color in the community. Derrick had spent his career upholding justice, and now he was the victim of the very assumptions and biases he'd been working to eradicate. "Thank you, Captain Harris," Derrick replied, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I understand mistakes happen, but let's not fool ourselves into thinking this was just a random oversight." Harris's jaw tightened, clearly grasping the underlying meaning of Derrick's words. "I hear you, Judge Walker, and I assure you, this officer's conduct will be reviewed thoroughly." Derrick glanced at Officer Grant, who was standing nearby, shifting uneasily on her feet. Her face was flushed, and her gaze wavered as if she wanted to say something, but was unsure how. Deciding to take this opportunity, Derrick addressed the captain directly. "Captain, I'd like a word with you and Officer Grant," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "Not as a victim, but as someone who believes that even unfortunate incidents like this can be turned into opportunities for change." Captain Harris looked taken aback, but quickly nodded in agreement. "Of course, Judge Walker, whatever you need." As they moved away from Derrick's car, he noticed a few more neighbors watching from their windows and porches. Curiosity mingled with something else in their expressions. Derrick knew that his reputation in this neighborhood had always come with added scrutiny. As a successful black man in a predominantly white area, he'd earned respect, but had always felt he had something to prove. Today's incident, however, had shifted something in him. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about making a real change that could help others who didn't have the same platform he did. "Captain," Derrick began as they reached Harris's car, "I think we need to have a serious discussion about the state of policing in this community. Don't you agree?" Harris looked at him with genuine interest. "I believe you're absolutely right, Judge Walker. Today's incident has opened my eyes to some issues I thought we'd already addressed. I'm all ears." Derrick turned to Officer Grant, who was standing slightly behind her captain, looking as if she wished she could disappear. "Officer Grant," Derrick said, meeting her eyes, "I'm not interested in seeing you lose your job. That wouldn't solve anything. What I'm interested in is finding a way to prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. How about spending a week shadowing me in my courtroom?" Grant's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of something like hope crossing her face. "Your Honor, you'd allow me to do that?" Derrick nodded. "Yes, you'll see firsthand the challenges people of color face in the justice system, the biases that affect sentencing, jury selection, and much more. I believe that with greater understanding, we can begin to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they serve." Captain Harris appeared thoughtful, nodding slowly as he considered Derrick's proposal. "That's an interesting idea, Judge, but I'm not sure our department has the resources for an extensive program like this." Derrick raised his hand to halt the captain's concern. "I'll make it happen. I'll speak with the chief of police myself if necessary. This is too important to let bureaucratic obstacles stand in the way." At that moment, one of Derrick's neighbors, Mrs. Wilson, approached them hesitantly, wringing her hands. She was an older woman, her hair a crown of white curls. Derrick had seen her many times, though they'd never spoken much. Now her face bore an expression of worry mixed with guilt. "Judge Walker, is everything all right?" she asked in a soft voice. "We saw what happened, and, well, we're all quite shocked." Derrick offered her a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Wilson. In fact, I think something good may come out of this incident." An idea sparked in Derrick's mind. He looked back at Captain Harris. "Captain, what if we expanded this program? Not just for Officer Grant, but for the entire precinct. And in return, I and other judges could spend time with your officers to better understand the challenges they face every day." Harris's eyes widened in surprise, but he seemed genuinely intrigued by the idea. "That's ambitious, Judge Walker, but I can see the potential benefits. More than benefits, actually. It could open up a much-needed dialogue between our department and the community." Derrick nodded in agreement. "It's about breaking down the walls that separate us, Captain. About fostering understanding and empathy on both sides." As Derrick spoke, he could see the impact his words were having. The neighbors who'd been watching from a distance had gathered closer, nodding in agreement. Even Officer Grant, who had been standing stiffly to the side, seemed to be listening more attentively now. "We have a unique opportunity here," Derrick continued, his voice strong and sure. "An opportunity to turn a moment of conflict into a chance for growth, to show our community that we're committed to justice in its truest form." Captain Harris rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It won't be easy, Judge. There will be resistance from some of my officers, as well as from others in the judicial system." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, Captain," Derrick replied firmly. "But I believe it's necessary. What happened here today isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue that we need to address head-on." As Derrick spoke, he noticed a young boy watching from a nearby sidewalk, his eyes wide with curiosity. It was Ethan, the son of a neighbor who often waved to Derrick as he left for work in the mornings. Feeling compelled to set an example, Derrick walked over to him, kneeling down to meet Ethan's gaze. "Hey there, Ethan," Derrick greeted, giving him a warm smile. "What do you think about all this?" Ethan glanced nervously at the police officers, then back at Derrick. I don't know. My dad says we should always respect the police, but they were being mean to you, and you didn't do anything wrong." Derrick nodded solemnly, appreciating the boy's honesty. "You're right, Ethan. I didn't do anything wrong. But here's the important part. Police officers are here to protect us. Sometimes they make mistakes, just like everyone else. What matters is how we handle those mistakes. Do we get angry and turn away, or do we try to understand each other and work together to make things better? Ethan thought about this for a moment, then smiled. Work together? Derrick ruffled the boy's hair, feeling a swell of pride and hope. Exactly, Ethan, and that's what we're going to try to do here. Turning back to Captain Harris and Officer Grant, Derrick felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about him, it was about creating a future where kids like Ethan could grow up without fear, in a community where justice was more than just a word. As Derrick stood with Captain Harris and Officer Grant, he noticed more neighbors gathering nearby, drawn by the presence of the police cars and the unusual scene unfolding before them. Curious faces peeked from behind curtains, and others ventured out onto their front lawns, quietly observing. Derrick could almost feel the whispers and the questioning glances cast his way. This was the neighborhood where he'd worked so hard to build his life, and in a matter of minutes, he had gone from being a respected community member to a suspect in the eyes of his neighbors. The quiet murmuring of the small crowd that had formed seemed to amplify Derrick's determination. This wasn't just a personal ordeal for him. It was about every person who had ever felt reduced to a stereotype, every person who'd been subjected to suspicion solely because of their appearance. Derrick felt that he owed it to them, and to the younger generation, to make sure this moment wasn't wasted. Derrick cleared his throat, gathering the attention of those around him. His voice was calm, but carried a weight of conviction. "Captain Harris," he began, "if this incident has shown us anything, it's that we have work to do. Not just you and I, but our entire community. We need to come together to have some real, honest discussions." Captain Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right, Judge Walker. This moment doesn't need to end here. It can be the start of something bigger." A flicker of hope stirred in Derrick as he turned to the gathered neighbors. "Many of you know me, or at least you know my work," he said, looking into the faces of those who had come to watch. "But today, I became a stranger in my own neighborhood, questioned and presumed guilty because of something as simple as the color of my skin." Some of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Derrick continued, "I think it's time for us to stop being silent about these issues. It's time we start talking openly as a community about what divides us and what can bring us together." Mrs. Wilson, who had been watching intently, took a hesitant step forward. "Judge Walker, I have to admit, when you first moved into the neighborhood, I had my reservations. I thought, well, I suppose I didn't know what to expect," she said, her voice faltering. Derrick gave her a small nod, appreciating her honesty. "Thank you for sharing that, Mrs. Wilson. We've all been shaped by biases. Sometimes we don't even realize they're there, but acknowledging them is the first step toward understanding each other." As Derrick spoke, he noticed the look on Officer Grant's face, a mixture of shame and contemplation. This whole encounter seemed to have left her genuinely shaken, and Derrick realized that maybe, just maybe, she was open to learning. Inspired, he turned back to the group. "I have an idea," he said, looking from Captain Harris to the assembled neighbors. "Why don't we organize a series of community meetings and town halls, if you will? A space where we can all come together, police officers, residents, local officials, and just talk. Not about punishment or blame, but about understanding each other's perspectives." Captain Harris considered the suggestion, nodding thoughtfully. "The police department would be glad to participate," he replied. "It's time we hear directly from the people we serve and understand their concerns in a more meaningful way." Derrick looked over at Officer Grant. She had been standing off to the side, arms crossed, a guarded expression on her face. But as Derrick's words reached her, her stance softened slightly. Finally, she took a small step forward, her gaze lowered. "Your Honor, I want to apologize," she said quietly, but her voice held conviction. "I made assumptions about you based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had. It was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'd be honored to participate in any program you're suggesting." Derrick extended his hand toward her, a warm but firm expression on his face. "Thank you, Officer Grant. Recognizing and admitting our own biases is a courageous first step. It takes strength to acknowledge when we're wrong." She hesitated for a moment, then accepted his handshake. A smattering of applause came from the crowd, and Derrick could see that many of his neighbors seemed moved by the moment. Some of them, he knew, had likely held their own biases, just as Mrs. Wilson had admitted. This small step, this handshake, was a symbol of the change that could ripple out beyond this single incident. "Judge Walker, you have our full support," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice wavering slightly but filled with resolve. "If there's anything we can do to help make this initiative a reality, count on us." Derrick smiled, grateful for the backing of his neighbors. This isn't just about the police or the court system, it's about all of us. When we come together as a community, we can start to break down the walls that divide us and foster a true sense of empathy and understanding. Captain Harris nodded firmly. "Judge Walker, I'll take this back to the precinct and make sure it's taken seriously. We need this kind of reform, and it's going to take all of us working together to make it happen." Derrick felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he saw the expressions of support from his neighbors. He knew that a single encounter wouldn't fix a system as complex as the one he was taking on, but it was a start. And for the first time since the incident had begun, Derrick felt a glimmer of hope that real change could come, not only for himself, but for everyone in the community. As the crowd began to disperse and the police cars started to pull away, Mrs. Wilson approached Derrick once more, this time looking directly into his eyes. "Judge Walker, I'll be honest with you," she said, her tone gentle but sincere. "When you first moved in, I was hesitant. I wasn't sure if you'd fit into our neighborhood. I'm ashamed of that now, and I hope you can forgive an old woman for her foolishness." Derrick smiled warmly, nodding his head. "Mrs. Wilson, forgiveness is the first step toward understanding. I'm just glad we're taking steps in the right direction." She smiled back, a mixture of relief and respect on her face. As she walked back to her house, Derrick felt a sense of accomplishment and a growing sense of purpose. This had begun as a humiliating encounter, but it was now transforming into something powerful, a movement toward understanding and unity. But as he stood there, watching the last of the police cars drive away, a lingering feeling remained in the back of his mind. Something about the whole situation felt off, as if it had been more than just a routine stop. The tension in his chest hadn't fully subsided, and he wondered if this was merely the beginning of something larger. He turned to go back inside his house, already contemplating the town halls, the meetings, the change that could take place. As he reached his front door, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, and the message contained only 4 words. "Watch your back, Judge." Derrick's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. A chill ran down his spine, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching him. What had seemed like a simple, albeit frustrating traffic stop, now carried a darker undertone. Was someone targeting him? He quickly stepped inside, locked the door behind him, and drew the curtains. He knew this wasn't something he could ignore. The day's events had taken an ominous turn, and Derrick's instincts told him he was only scratching the surface of something much larger and much more dangerous. Inside his home, Derrick's mind was racing. The text message, "Watch your back, Judge," was a clear warning, but from whom? Derrick had made his share of enemies over the years. It came with the territory of being a judge. Still, something about this felt different, more personal. This wasn't an ordinary reminder of the risks that came with his job. This was a direct threat, a reminder that he was being watched. Derrick saved the number and took a screenshot of the message before dialing his longtime friend, Detective Raymond Lee, someone he trusted implicitly. Raymond had always been one of the few people Derrick could confide in without hesitation, someone who understood the balance of law and justice. Derrick knew that if anyone could help him dig deeper into this matter, it would be Raymond. After a few rings, Raymond's familiar voice came through the line, warm but with a hint of concern. "Derrick? What's going on?" Derrick took a deep breath, quickly recounting the events of the day, the traffic stop, the proposal for police reform, and the mysterious text message. He didn't leave out any details, knowing that Raymond would need the full picture to truly understand the gravity of the situation. When he was finished, Raymond was silent for a moment. Then, with a tone that was both calm and deadly serious, he said, "Derrick, this is more than just a coincidence. Whoever sent that message wanted to make sure you felt threatened. I'll start tracing the number right away, but you need to be careful. If someone's targeting you, it's important that we find out who's behind this and why." "Thank you, Ray," Derrick replied, grateful for his friend's support. "But let's keep this off the books for now. I don't want this to blow up without knowing what we're dealing with." "Understood," Raymond agreed. "I'll let you know as soon as I have anything." After hanging up, Derrick paced his living room, his earlier optimism fading into a gnawing worry. The day had started as an ordinary afternoon, yet now he found himself swept up in something much darker. He couldn't ignore the possibility that the traffic stop and the message were connected, but how? Just as he was trying to piece it together, there was a soft knock at the door. Derrick's heart raced as he cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. To his relief, it was a young boy from the neighborhood, Ethan, the same boy he'd spoken to during the incident earlier. Ethan was standing on the porch, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Derrick opened the door, putting on a reassuring smile. "Hey, Ethan, what's up?" Ethan looked up at him with wide, concerned eyes. "Judge Walker, I heard my dad talking on the phone. He sounded really angry and he said your name. Something about teaching him a lesson. I thought you should know." A chill settled over Derrick, but he kept his voice calm for Ethan's sake. "Thank you, Ethan. That was very brave of you to come and tell me. Now, don't worry, everything's going to be fine, okay?" Ethan gave a small nod, but Derrick could see the worry lingering in the boy's eyes. "Okay, sir, just be careful." As Ethan hurried back down the driveway, Derrick closed the door, his mind racing. Ethan's father, Jack Wilson, was a local business owner, a powerful man in the community who had once stood trial in Derrick's courtroom. Just a year ago, Derrick had ruled against Wilson in a discrimination case, costing him a major contract and damaging his reputation. Could Wilson be behind the threat? It was possible. But if that was the case, how far would Wilson be willing to go? Derrick's phone rang again, and he saw Raymond's name flash on the screen. He picked up, grateful for the distraction. "Ray, any updates?" "I traced the number," Raymond replied, his voice tense. "It's a burner phone. But here's the thing, it's been making calls to the police station. Derrick, it seems like there's more going on here than just a grudge." Derrick's pulse quickened. "The police station? You're saying someone inside the department could be involved?" "I don't know for sure," Raymond admitted, "but it's looking likely. Whoever is behind this has connections, and they're using those connections to keep tabs on you." "Derrick, I think this goes deeper than you realize." Derrick's thoughts raced as he processed the information. The idea that a police officer or even a network within the department could be part of this threat against him was almost too disturbing to believe. Yet Derrick knew the harsh reality of corruption that often lurked within systems that were meant to serve and protect. "Ray, I need your help," Derrick said firmly. "If this involves people within the police department, I can't trust anyone else. We need to gather as much information as we can before they realize we're on to them." "You got it," Raymond replied. "But Derrick, be careful. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about protecting the integrity of the whole system. I'll dig around, but you watch your back." After hanging up, Derrick sat down, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind flashed back to his conversation with Captain Harris and the proposal for reform. If his efforts to bring about change had made him a target, then the stakes were even higher than he'd realized. He knew he couldn't back down, but the risks were growing with every passing moment. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Forcing himself to stay calm, Derrick approached the door and looked through the peephole. Standing on his porch, looking slightly nervous, was Captain Harris. Derrick opened the door cautiously, his guard still up. "Captain Harris, this is unexpected." Harris gave him a grave nod, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "Judge Walker, we need to talk." Privately, Derrick led him to the living room, every nerve on edge as he tried to gauge the captain's intentions. Once they were seated, Harris leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Derrick, there's no easy way to say this. We received an anonymous tip, accusations of corruption against you. allegations of bribery and misconduct on the bench. The words hit Derrick like a punch to the gut. He stared at Harris, his mind racing. You can't seriously believe this. These accusations are absurd. Harris held up his hand, his expression grim. I don't want to believe it, Derrick. But you know how this works. There will be an investigation, and I had to warn you. It's not looking good. Derrick felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. This wasn't just a threat. This was a calculated attempt to dismantle everything he'd built. The traffic stop, the warning text, Ethan's message, and now these allegations were all connected. Someone wanted to destroy his credibility and discredit him entirely. But who? And why? As Captain Harris left, Derrick sat in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was a coordinated attack, aimed not only at his reputation, but at the entire reform effort he'd proposed. Whoever was behind this was powerful and willing to do whatever it took to stop him. Derrick spent a sleepless night, piecing together everything he knew, his determination hardening with each passing hour. By morning, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't trust anyone, not the police, and not even his colleagues in the legal system. He would have to take matters into his own hands. Calling in sick to work, something he'd never done in his career, Derrick began combing through old case files, looking for anything that might provide a clue. Names, court transcripts, incidents he'd presided over. He needed to find out who held a grudge against him, powerful enough to go to such lengths. And soon, a pattern began to emerge. Several of his recent rulings had gone against a local construction company, Omega Builders. They had a history of violating labor laws, discrimination practices, and environmental regulations. And the owner? None other than Jack Wilson, Ethan's father. But how did this tie into the police? And why now? A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. As Derrick peered through the peephole, his pulse quickened. It was Officer Casey Grant. Derrick's heart raced as he saw Officer Casey Grant on his doorstep. The officer who had stopped him the day before now stood outside his home, glancing around nervously, as if she didn't want to be seen. Taking a deep breath, Derrick unlocked the door and opened it a crack, leaving the chain on for security. "Officer Grant," he greeted cautiously, "what brings you here?" Grant shifted on her feet, her eyes darting around the street before returning to him. "Judge Walker," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to you. It's about what happened yesterday. There's more to it than you know." Derrick studied her face for a moment before removing the chain and opening the door fully. "Come in," he said, his tone guarded. As she stepped inside, he led her to the living room, where they both sat down. He could see her hands trembling slightly, the tough exterior she'd worn during their last encounter, now softened by something resembling fear. "What's going on, Officer Grant?" Derrick asked, keeping his tone firm yet approachable. Grant took a deep breath, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Judge Walker, that traffic stop, it wasn't random. I was ordered to pull you over." Derrick's eyes widened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "The order came from higher up," she said, voice barely a whisper. "They told me to find any reason to stop you and to provoke you if possible. I didn't know why at the time. I just followed orders. But now, after seeing everything that's happened, I knew I couldn't keep quiet anymore." Derrick leaned back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a case of routine profiling, it was a deliberate attempt to set him up. And if Officer Grant had been following orders, this plot was bigger than he'd initially thought. "Who gave you the order?" he asked, his voice a low, steady demand. Grant shook her head. "I don't know exactly. The order was passed down from the deputy chief. All I know is that they wanted you to react, to give them something they could use against you." Derrick clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and they painted a disturbing picture. Someone wanted to bring him down, and they were willing to manipulate both the legal system and the police department to do it. "Why are you telling me this now?" Derrick asked, his gaze sharp and searching. Officer Grant looked down, shame evident in her expression. "Because what you said yesterday, it got to me," she admitted quietly. "I became a cop to protect people, to do good. But yesterday made me realize I've been a pawn in someone else's game. And then when I heard about the accusations of corruption against you, I knew something was wrong. I don't want to be part of this. I want to help, if I can. Just as Derrick was about to respond, there was a knock on the door. He froze, glancing quickly at Officer Grant, who looked just as alarmed. Slowly, Derrick approached the door and peered through the peephole. To his relief, it was Detective Raymond Lee. Derrick opened the door, letting Raymond in. But as Raymond entered, he stopped short upon seeing Officer Grant. His expression turned wary. "What's she doing here?" Quickly, Derrick brought Raymond up to speed, explaining everything that Officer Grant had revealed. With each new revelation, Raymond's face grew darker, his brows knitting together in concern. "This goes deeper than we thought," Raymond muttered, crossing his arms. "I did some digging on Omega Builders, Derrick. They're currently bidding on a massive city contract, one that's worth millions. But with their history of violations, they should be disqualified, unless they can discredit the judge responsible for their legal troubles." Derrick's eyes narrowed, the puzzle pieces coming together in his mind. "So if they can ruin my reputation, the rulings I made against them could be called into question. And if that happens, Omega Builders could get the contract." Grant spoke up, a new resolve in her voice. "I've heard rumors at the station, Judge Walker. There are officers who might be in Omega's pocket. They've been burying complaints, looking the other way on violations. I thought it was just gossip, but now I'm not so sure." Derrick exchanged a glance with Raymond, both of them understanding the gravity of what was unfolding. This wasn't just about him. It was a network of corruption that reached far beyond his personal life. It was a system that allowed powerful people to manipulate justice for their own gain. "We need proof," Derrick said, his voice firm. "Without hard evidence, it's our word against theirs." Raymond nodded, his expression steely. "I can try to get access to some internal police records. If we can link these officers to Omega Builders, we'll have what we need. But it won't be easy, and if they catch on to what we're doing, they won't hesitate to shut us down." Officer Grant looked up, determination flashing in her eyes. "I can help. I know which officers to keep an eye on, the ones who've been acting suspiciously, and I still have access to certain files." Derrick felt a surge of hope at her words. Despite the risk, she was willing to stand with him, to expose the truth, even if it meant going against her own department. He looked at both of them, feeling a sense of solidarity. They were an unlikely team, a judge, a detective, and a patrol officer brought together by circumstance and conviction. "It's risky," Derrick said, his gaze shifting between Raymond and Grant. "If we're caught, we could lose everything. But it's worth it if we can expose what's happening here." Raymond placed a hand on Derrick's shoulder, his expression resolute. "We're with you, Derrick. This is bigger than any of us." As they began to plan their next moves, Derrick felt the weight of what they were taking on. They were up against powerful people with far-reaching connections, people who wouldn't hesitate to protect their interests by any means necessary. But Derrick knew they couldn't back down. Too much was at stake, not just his career, but the integrity of the entire justice system. By the time they'd formulated a plan, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Derrick's living room. Their strategy was simple, but dangerous. Gather the evidence, connect Omega Builders to the corrupt officers, and take it public. It was the only way to ensure the truth couldn't be buried. Just as they were finalizing the details, Derrick's phone buzzed. He glanced down and saw another message from the same unknown number as before. His stomach tightened as he read the words, "Back off, Judge." Last warning. Derrick held the phone out for Raymond and Grant to see. They read the message, and a shared understanding passed between them. The stakes had just been raised. Whoever was behind this was aware of their actions and was willing to use threats to stop them. "They're getting nervous," Raymond said, his voice low. "We must be on the right track." Grant nodded, her face set in determination. "So, what's our next move, Judge?" Derrick looked at his two allies, feeling both fear and resolve. This was dangerous territory, and they were stepping into it willingly. But Derrick also knew they had the strength and the truth on their side. "We follow the money," he said firmly, the fire of conviction burning in his eyes. "Every corrupt deal leaves a trail. We just need to find it." As night fell over the city, Derrick, Raymond, and Officer Grant leaned over documents, laptops, and files, their minds set on the task ahead. The stakes were higher than they'd ever imagined, but so was their determination. They were no longer just defending Derrick's reputation. They were fighting for a justice system that the community could believe in. And as they worked into the night, none of them noticed the figure watching them from a car parked down the street, phone in hand, eyes fixed on Derrick's house. The hours slipped by as Derrick, Raymond, and Officer Grant pored over documents, cross-referenced files, and scoured for any connection that could expose Omega Builders' influence over the police department. The air in Derrick's living room was thick with tension, the table cluttered with printouts and notes. The faint hum of the laptop was the only sound, accompanied by the steady ticking of the wall clock. "Look at this," Raymond said suddenly, pointing to his laptop screen. "There's a pattern of large deposits going into Deputy Chief Richards' account. The dates line up with key decisions and city inspections favoring Omega Builders." Derrick leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the bank records. "Can we trace those deposits directly to Omega?" Raymond shook his head. "Not directly. The money is coming from a shell company, but I dug deeper and found that this shell company is registered under a law firm that's represented Omega Builders in several cases." Officer Grant frowned, looking over the records. "And Richards has been pushing hard for increased patrols in areas where Omega Builders owns properties. He claimed it was for community safety, but now it's obvious that something else was motivating him." Derrick clenched his fists. The pieces were finally coming together, revealing a dark, corrupt network. But it wasn't enough. They needed something irrefutable, something that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial. A loud knock on the door broke the silence, making them all jump. Derrick froze, his heart pounding. He exchanged a glance with Raymond and Officer Grant, all of them on high alert. "Stay here," Derrick whispered, moving cautiously to the door. Peering through the peephole, he felt his stomach drop. It was Captain Jeffrey Harris. "Captain Harris," Derrick said quietly to the others, "I need you to hide. If he's part of this, we can't risk him seeing you here." Raymond and Grant exchanged worried glances, then nodded. They quickly gathered the documents and slipped into the kitchen, out of sight. Derrick took a deep breath and opened the door, forcing a calm expression. "Captain Harris, this is unexpected." Harris's face was grim as he stepped inside, looking around as though he sensed the tension in the air. "Judge Walker, may I come in?" Derrick nodded, leading him into the living room and watching his every move. "To what do I owe this visit, Captain?" Harris took a deep breath, his face heavy with an emotion Derrick couldn't quite read. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "Judge Walker, I think it's time for me to be honest with you. I've been noticing irregularities within the department for months now, but every time I tried to look into it, I hit a wall." Derrick studied him carefully, feeling a glimmer of hope but also caution. "Are you saying you're not involved in any of this?" Harris shook his head, a flicker of shame crossing his face. "No, I'm not involved, but I've been afraid to dig too deep. Whoever's behind this, they have influence. I was worried about my family, my career." He looked down, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. Derrick allowed himself a small sigh of relief. "So you're willing to help us?" Harris met his gaze, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "Yes. What do you need?" Derrick quickly called Raymond and Grant back into the room. Captain Harris looked surprised to see them, but didn't question their presence. Raymond wasted no time, filling him in on everything they'd uncovered about the connections between Deputy Chief Richards, Omega Builders, and the corruption within the department. As Harris listened, his face grew darker, his jaw clenching with each new revelation. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. "Deputy Chief Richards has been one of the most vocal advocates for increased security measures, and I trusted him." Grant stepped forward, her voice steady. "Captain, we need access to internal department records, documents that only someone in your position can provide. It's the only way we can link Richards and his allies to Omega Builders." Harris hesitated, glancing around the room, but finally nodded. "All right, I'll get you what you need, but we need to act fast. If Richards or anyone else finds out we're onto them, they'll shut this down before we get a chance to expose it." The group worked tirelessly through the night. Harris pulling up encrypted department files, while Derrick, Raymond, and Grant sorted through everything, connecting the dots of a sprawling conspiracy. As dawn began to creep through the windows, they realized they had gathered a mountain of evidence. Financial records, suspicious transfers, doctored reports, and false arrests, all tied to Richards and a small group of officers within the department. "We've got the evidence," Raymond said, rubbing his tired eyes. "But now comes the hard part. If we go to the local authorities, there's no guarantee this won't be buried. These people have connections, likely all the way up to the mayor's office." Derrick paced the room, his mind racing as he considered their options. "We need to make this public, get it in the hands of someone who can't be intimidated or bought." "The press?" Officer Grant suggested. Harris shook his head. "It's too risky. We don't know who we can trust." A memory sparked in Derrick's mind, and he looked up, his gaze sharp. "I know someone. Sarah Chen. She's an old law school friend of mine, and she works in the state attorney general's office. If we can get this evidence to her, we might have a shot at stopping this." Raymond nodded. The state attorney general's office would be outside the reach of these local players. It could work. Just as they started to plan their next move, the blare of a car alarm pierced the early morning silence. They all froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Derrick rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. His blood ran cold as he saw two unmarked cars parked across the street, their occupants watching his house intently. "We've got company," he said, his voice tense. Harris moved to another window, his face grim. "They know we're onto them. We need to move now." Officer Grant's voice shook slightly. "How are we going to get out without them seeing?" Derrick's mind raced. He knew his home well and suddenly remembered the small, rarely used back gate that led into an alley behind the property. "I have an idea. There's a back gate. It leads to an alley that connects to the next street over." They quickly put together a plan. Harris would leave openly, drawing the attention of the men watching the house. Meanwhile, Derrick, Raymond, and Grant would slip out the back and head straight for the state attorney general's office. "Once you're clear," Harris said, his voice laced with urgency, "don't stop for anything. Head directly to Sarah Chen and get this evidence into her hands. I'll meet you there, if I can shake these guys." Derrick gripped Harris's arm, gratitude flashing in his eyes. "Thank you, Captain, for everything." Harris gave him a solemn nod. "Just promise me one thing, Judge. When this is over, we'll clean house for real. No more half measures." Derrick nodded. "You have my word." A few moments later, Harris strode out the front door, making a show of checking his watch as he walked toward his car. As predicted, one of the unmarked cars followed him as he pulled away. Derrick and the others wasted no time, slipping quietly through the kitchen and out the back door. Moving quickly but cautiously, they crept along the fence until they reached the gate, which Derrick eased open with a soft creak. They slipped into the alley, moving through the early morning shadows. Just as they reached the end of the alley, a shout rang out behind them. "They've spotted us," Grant whispered, her face pale. "Run," Derrick ordered. They broke into a sprint, dashing down the street toward Raymond's car parked a block away. Behind them, they could hear footsteps and voices growing louder. As they piled into the car, a shot rang out, shattering the rear window. Raymond floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as they sped away. Derrick glanced back, his heart racing. "Is everyone okay?" Grant nodded, though she was clutching her arm, blood staining her sleeve. "I'm fine, just a graze." "Hold on," Raymond said, weaving through traffic. "We're almost there." As they approached the state attorney general's office, Derrick clutched the flash drive containing all the evidence. It was their lifeline, everything they'd worked for. But as they neared the intersection, Derrick's stomach dropped. There was a police blockade stretched across the road. "It's a trap," he said, his voice hoarse. "They knew we'd come here." Raymond's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "What now, Derrick?" Derrick's mind raced, desperation filling his thoughts. There was only one option left. "The media," he said, his voice strong. "It's our only chance. Head for Channel 7 News. We're going to broadcast everything." As Raymond swerved onto a side street, narrowly avoiding the blockade, Derrick knew they were running out of time. But he also knew that sometimes a narrow window of time was all it took to change the world. The city streets blurred by as Raymond maneuvered through early morning traffic, pushing the car to its limits. Derrick clutched the flash drive containing their evidence, his heart pounding with both fear and determination. Their destination, Channel 7 News, was now their last hope. If they could broadcast the evidence publicly, they could ensure the truth reached millions, beyond the reach of those who wanted to silence them. As they approached the Channel 7 building, Derrick spotted police cars converging from side streets. His stomach dropped as he realized their pursuers were closing in. "They're boxing us in," he said, his voice tight. "We need to hurry." Raymond nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "Hang on, we're almost there." Just as they reached the building's entrance, the car was suddenly struck from the side. A large SUV rammed into them, sending their vehicle spinning across the road. Derrick's world went black as the sound of metal against metal filled his ears. When Derrick regained consciousness, his head throbbed and he could taste blood. The car was on its side, steam hissing from the crushed hood. Blinking, he looked around. Raymond was slumped over the steering wheel, a gash bleeding on his forehead, while Officer Grant in the back seat groaned in pain. "Raymond! Grant!" Derrick called, his voice hoarse. Raymond stirred, his face contorted in pain but still conscious. I'm okay, I think." He glanced over his shoulder, concern filling his eyes as he saw Officer Grant. "Grant, are you all right?" Grant let out a strained breath, her face pale. "My leg's pinned. I can't move it." Derrick's mind raced, and he quickly checked his pockets, feeling a surge of relief as his fingers found the flash drive. Their evidence was still safe. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, unbuckling his seatbelt. "Can you move, Raymond?" Raymond nodded, his movements slow but determined, as he forced open the damaged door. He climbed out, and Derrick followed, stumbling slightly as he tried to find his footing. He then turned to help Officer Grant, who was struggling to free her leg from the wreckage. "My leg, it's stuck," she said, panic creeping into her voice. "Hold on, we'll get you out," Derrick assured her, pulling at the crushed metal door alongside Raymond. Ignoring the pain from their cuts and bruises, they finally managed to create enough space for Grant to slide free. The sound of sirens grew louder as they helped Grant onto the sidewalk. Derrick looked toward the Channel 7 building, just a few hundred yards away. Their goal was so close, yet the police cars bearing down on them seemed closer. "We can't outrun them with Grant injured," Raymond said, glancing over his shoulder at the approaching officers. Derrick made a split-second decision. "You two create a distraction. I'll make a run for the news station." "No way," Grant protested. "We're in this together." Derrick placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. "This is bigger than any of us. The truth needs to come out, no matter what. I'll have the best chance of getting through alone." Raymond and Grant exchanged a reluctant look before nodding. Raymond handed Derrick the flash drive, his eyes filled with resolve. "Be careful, Derrick. We'll do our best to keep them off you." With that, Derrick took off running toward the building. Behind him, he could hear Raymond and Grant shouting, drawing the attention of the officers who had arrived at the crash scene. Derrick's lungs burned as he sprinted, every muscle in his body protesting, but he pushed himself forward, fueled by the weight of what was at stake. Halfway to the entrance, a police cruiser skidded to a stop in front of him, blocking his path. Derrick veered sharply, dashing down a narrow alley beside the building. He could hear the heavy footsteps of an officer following him, but he didn't dare look back. The alley was a maze of dumpsters and fire escapes. Derrick zigzagged through obstacles, vaulting over a pile of cardboard boxes and ducking under a low-hanging pipe. The officer's footsteps grew closer, his heavy breathing echoing behind Derrick. Just as Derrick thought he might lose his lead, he spotted a door slightly ajar on the side of the building. Without hesitation, he slipped inside. He found himself in a dimly lit storeroom filled with stacks of supplies. Crouching behind a shelf, Derrick tried to quiet his breathing, listening as the officer's footsteps pounded past the door. A voice crackled over the officer's radio. "All units, be advised, suspect Derrick Walker is heading toward Channel 7 News. Apprehend at all costs. Consider him armed and dangerous." Derrick felt a chill at the words. Whoever was orchestrating this was determined to paint him as a criminal, twisting the narrative to discredit anything he might reveal. He needed to get to the newsroom before they could take control of the story. Moving cautiously, Derrick navigated through the building's hallways. He soon realized with a jolt that he was in the building adjacent to Channel 7, separated only by a narrow alley. A risky idea flashed through his mind. If he could make it to the roof, he might be able to jump across. Derrick found a stairwell and climbed quickly, emerging on the rooftop, the cool morning air hitting him as he surveyed the Channel 7 building next door. It was about 10 feet across, doable but daunting. Taking a deep breath, Derrick backed up, then sprinted toward the edge. As he reached the ledge, he launched himself across the gap. For a terrifying moment, he was airborne, the alley yawning beneath him. His feet hit the opposite roof, and he rolled to absorb the impact. Panting, Derrick picked himself up and found the roof access door. He descended into the Channel 7 building, hearing the hum of voices and equipment as he approached the newsroom. Stepping into the brightly lit space, he saw producers, camera operators, and reporters prepping for the morning broadcast. Summoning his courage, Derrick called out, his voice carrying over the bustling room. "My name is Judge Derrick Walker. I have evidence of widespread corruption in our city's police force and government, and I need to speak on air immediately." A hush fell over the newsroom as heads turned to look at him. After a moment, a woman stepped forward, her expression sharp and calculating. Linda Park, the executive producer, eyed him critically. "You have 2 minutes to convince me why I should risk my career for this." Derrick met her gaze, every word weighted with urgency as he explained the evidence they had uncovered, the ties between Omega Builders and the police, and the lengths powerful figures were going to silence him. He didn't leave out any detail, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. When he finished, Linda's face was unreadable for a long moment. Finally, she turned to her team and barked, "Get him to makeup. We're going live in 10. The room erupted into action as a makeup artist hurried over, dabbing at Derrick's cuts and bruises, while Linda briefed him on what to expect. "You'll have 5 minutes. Be clear, be concise, and be ready for pushback. Once this airs, all hell is going to break loose." Derrick nodded, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. He took his seat on the set, the bright studio lights blinding, as he focused on the anchor seated across from him. "We're live in 30 seconds, someone called. Derrick closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He thought of Raymond, Grant, and everyone who had been wronged by the corrupt system he was fighting against. He thought of the younger generation, kids like Ethan, growing up in a world where justice seemed so far out of reach. The anchor turned to him as the broadcast began. "We interrupt our regular programming for a special report. Joining us now is Judge Derrick Walker, who claims to have evidence of widespread corruption in our city's government and police force. Judge Walker, you have the floor." Derrick looked directly into the camera, his voice calm but forceful as he began. "Citizens of our city, I come to you with a heavy heart and an urgent message. Our justice system, the very foundation of our society, has been corrupted." As he spoke, he saw the shock and realization dawn on the faces around him. Phones began ringing in the background as his words sent shockwaves through the station. Derrick was halfway through his explanation when the studio doors burst open. A group of police officers, led by Deputy Chief Richards, stormed in. "Cut the feed!" Richards bellowed, fury etched across his face. "This man is under arrest." Linda Park stepped forward, blocking the officers with a look of steel. "We're live, gentlemen. Any attempt to interfere will be seen by millions." Richards hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and the backlash that would come from stopping the broadcast. Derrick seized the moment, raising his voice. "Citizens, what you're witnessing now is an attempt to silence the truth. Don't let this be buried. Demand answers, demand justice." As the officers moved toward him, Derrick stood tall, his voice ringing out. "The truth will prevail. Remember this day. One voice can make a difference." The last thing viewers saw before the feed cut was Derrick being led away in handcuffs, his head held high. As Derrick was led out of the newsroom in handcuffs, the city was already buzzing with reactions. On street corners, people gathered around their phones, watching clips of Derrick's broadcast. Social media was flooded with videos and messages as viewers shared Derrick's call to action with hashtags demanding justice and accountability. Derrick's words had sparked a fire, and it was spreading. The truth he had revealed was already beyond the reach of those who had tried to silence him. Outside the Channel 7 building, Derrick was escorted into a waiting police car. As it pulled away, he glimpsed the city skyline bathed in the golden light of dawn, and despite his current situation, he felt a glimmer of hope. His message was out there, and people were listening. Whatever happened next, he knew he had ignited something bigger than himself. The car pulled up to the police station, where reporters and camera crews had already gathered, shouting questions and flashing cameras as Derrick was led inside. Officers argued in hushed tones, the station filled with tension as the weight of Derrick's broadcast began to sink in. Derrick was taken to an interrogation room and left alone, the door slamming shut behind him. Hours passed as he waited, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. Finally, the door creaked open, and to Derrick's surprise, Captain Jeffrey Harris entered, looking haggard but resolute. "Judge Walker," he said quietly, sitting across from Derrick. "You've stirred up one hell of a hornet's nest. The whole city is up in arms. Protests have started, and people are demanding answers." Derrick leaned forward, his eyes intense. "And the evidence? The flash drive?" Captain Harris gave a small nod, his face softening with relief. "Detective Johnson managed to get it to Sarah Chen at the State Attorney General's office before he was detained. They're going through everything now." Derrick let out a slow breath, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The evidence was in safe hands. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Harris could answer, the door flew open again. Deputy Chief Richards stormed in, his face twisted with fury. "You're finished, Walker," he snarled, barely containing his rage. "By the time we're done with you, you'll be lucky if you ever see daylight again." But Captain Harris rose, placing himself between Derrick and Richards. "That's enough, Deputy Chief," he said, his voice firm. "The State Attorney General's office has taken over this investigation. Judge Walker is to be released immediately." Richards' face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to respond. You can't do that. You don't have the authority." "Actually, I do," a new voice replied. Sarah Chen stepped into the room, flanked by two stern-looking agents. She nodded curtly at Derrick before turning her sharp gaze to Richards. "By order of the State Attorney General, this entire department is now under investigation. Deputy Chief Richards, you're under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy." Richards sputtered, his face going red with anger and humiliation. "This is ridiculous. You can't." "Save it for the courtroom," Sarah replied coldly, motioning to the agents to take Richards into custody. As Richards was led away, his protests echoing down the hall, Sarah turned to Derrick, her expression softening. "You took one hell of a risk, Derrick, but it paid off. We have enough evidence to bring down half of the city government." In the days that followed, Derrick found himself at the center of a whirlwind of media attention, legal proceedings, and public outcry. The evidence he and his allies had uncovered proved to be damning. One by one, corrupt officials were arrested, from low-level cops to high-ranking city officials. Omega Builders' illegal activities were exposed, and the company quickly crumbled under the weight of the scandal. Jack Wilson, Ethan's father and the owner of Omega Builders, was among those arrested, charged with bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. For Derrick, there was a sense of satisfaction in knowing justice was being served. But there was also a lingering unease. He knew that simply arresting a few bad actors wouldn't be enough. The system that allowed this corruption to thrive was still intact. Real change would require more than just a few arrests. It would require a transformation of the structures and attitudes that had fostered this corruption in the first place. It was this thought that led Derrick to make a decision that would shape the rest of his life. On a crisp autumn morning, he stood before a podium outside the courthouse, cameras flashing as reporters gathered to hear him speak. Taking a deep breath, Derrick began, his voice steady and clear. "Citizens of our city, we have endured a storm of corruption, a breach of trust by those we relied on to serve and protect us. But we have also seen the power of truth, the courage of those willing to stand up for what's right. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, many of them watching with a mix of respect and curiosity. It is not enough to simply remove a few corrupt individuals, he continued. We must examine the entire system, the structures that allowed this corruption to thrive. That's why today, I am announcing my resignation from the bench. A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise flashing across the faces of many. Derrick raised a hand to quiet them, a determined expression on his face. I'm stepping down not because I am guilty, but because I believe I can do more good outside the system. Today, I am founding an independent watchdog organization dedicated to rooting out corruption and ensuring transparency in our government and law enforcement agencies. As he outlined his vision, Derrick saw a spark of hope in the eyes of those around him. His new organization, he explained, would be a bridge between the people and the government, a tool to hold those in power accountable and prevent future injustices. The road ahead would be challenging, but Derrick felt ready to face it. In the weeks that followed, Derrick poured himself into his new role. He assembled a team of dedicated individuals, including Raymond Johnson and Officer Casey Grant, who had both been cleared of any wrongdoing and were eager to join his cause. Together, they worked tirelessly to build an organization that would serve as a check on power and a voice for those who had been silenced. It wasn't easy. They faced resistance from those who preferred the status quo, threats from those with something to hide, but they also found allies in unexpected places. Honest cops who were tired of the corruption, community leaders who wanted to see real change, and ordinary citizens inspired to take a stand. 1 year after his fateful broadcast, Derrick found himself standing in the community center of his old neighborhood. The room was packed with people from all walks of life, gathered to hear about the progress his organization had made. As he looked out at the crowd, Derrick spotted a familiar face, Ethan, the young boy who had warned him about his father's threats. Ethan was older now, his face more serious, but his eyes still held that same spark of curiosity. After the meeting, Ethan approached Derrick, his expression a mixture of pride and sadness. Mr. Walker, Ethan began hesitantly. I just wanted to thank you. What you did, it changed things. My dad, he's in prison now, but I understand why, and I want to help make things better, like you did. Derrick felt a lump in his throat as he placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You already have, Ethan. Standing up for what's right is the first step, and that's exactly what you did that day. As Ethan walked away, Derrick felt a renewed sense of purpose. The work was far from over, but they had made progress. There would always be those who sought to abuse power, but there would also always be those willing to stand against them. Later that night, as Derrick stood on the balcony of his apartment overlooking the city, he thought of how far they had come and how far they still had to go. The system wasn't perfect, but it was more transparent, more accountable, and people were watching. As he turned to go inside, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Chen. A new lead on corruption in the mayor's office. Are you up for another fight? Derrick smiled, feeling the familiar spark of determination. His reply was simple, always. And as he looked out over the city lights, Derrick felt at peace. He had chosen a difficult path, one that might never truly end. But it was the right path. For as long as people raised their voices against injustice, there was hope for change. This powerful story of Judge Derrick Walker's battle against systemic corruption and prejudice holds valuable lessons about courage, accountability, and the power of a single voice. His journey reminds us that justice is not simply about removing a few bad actors, but about addressing the deep-seated issues within institutions that allow bias and corruption to flourish. Derrick's choice to step outside his position as a judge and establish an organization committed to transparency and integrity highlights the need for proactive change and the role of community involvement in creating a fairer society. The story also emphasizes the importance of allyship and unity. Derrick's alliance with Detective Raymond Lee and Officer Casey Grant shows how people from different backgrounds can come together to stand up for justice. Each character's growth and willingness to face the risks involved reveal the impact of integrity, even when it seems easier to remain silent. In a broader sense, Derrick's journey serves as a reminder that change often requires sacrifice, resilience, and the strength to confront the very structures we rely on. This story invites us all to reflect on our roles in supporting fairness and standing up against injustice, no matter the risks. If you found this story inspiring, comment with the number 1. If it resonated deeply with you, comment with the number 2. And we'd love to hear about your own experiences or stories of standing up for justice. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Share your thoughts and reflections on this story in the comments below.